Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Julia Fetters and this is Lauren Zoller.
Hi.
We are the creators of Femme Fest ICT and are currently seniors at East High School in Wichita, Kansas. Femme Fest is an intersectional feminist film festival that we founded in 2019 during our junior year. And Femme Fest ICT celebrates the power that film has to connect us and shine a light on important social issues.
On behalf of everyone involved at Femme Fest ICT, we are honored to present our second year of the festival. Although we originally planned for an in-person experience in Wichita, we are excited to be able to continue it virtually and with Mama Film. And we're welcoming audience members from around the country and looking at the chat, even the world.
Ooh,
The Netherlands.
Netherlands.
Awesome.
Hey! This year, Lauren and I chose to make FemFest's theme around voting, as it is a census year, the year of a presidential election, and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And we, amongst many other young people, will be voting for the very first time.
Yep. So we'd like to talk about the structure of this discussion a little bit. We're going to start off by asking our special guests some questions about the film and themselves, and then we will open it up to the audience for a Q&A. And if you have any questions during the discussion for the special guests, Katie Fahey and Dr. Brian Amos, please feel free to leave them in the chat. And please remember that if you are not speaking, to mute yourself, and please be respectful of everyone speaking or currently in the chat. We have a couple moderators who will monitor questions and comments throughout the discussion. And if you have access to the chat function, please introduce yourself with your name and your town. We'd love to see who joined us. And just to make sure that everybody knows, to access the chat, click the chat button in the bottom panel of Zoom.
To begin, we would like to introduce our panelists. First is Katie Fahey. We all saw her in the film, and we are honored to have her as our guest. Katie Fahey graduated from Aquinas College in 2011 with dual degrees in sustainable business and community leadership, and has completed work toward her MBA in sustainable business with an emphasis in public policy throughout Marylhurst University. With a passion for sustainability and public policy, Fahey's career began with Spartan Nash, a grocery distributor / retailer, where she created their first sustainability program. She went to work for the Michigan Recycling Center. Now, Katie Fahey is co-founder and executive director of The People, a nascent nonprofit organization of Americans coming together to restore everyday people's role in the political process and their trust in one another. The People connects individuals nationwide across the ideological spectrum to find common ground around nonpartisan good governance reforms and to navigate the political process to effect structural change. This work is informed and inspired by Katie's experiences in her home state of Michigan, responding to the extreme divisiveness in politics following the 2016 election. Katie posted on Facebook asking if anyone would like to take on gerrymandering in Michigan, and almost by accident started a political movement. As a result, she went on to serve as executive director of Voters Not Politicians, a volunteer-driven, nonpartisan campaign that ran a successful grassroots effort to end partisan gerrymandering in Michigan. Katie wound up leading a volunteer army of over 10,000 strong from all 83 counties in the state that managed, against all odds, to pass a transpartisan ballot proposing with 61% of the vote. Over 2.5 million Michiganders voted to amend the state constitution to create an independent citizens redistricting commission, which is poised to draw its first set of fair maps in 2021.
So, and then our next guest is It's a very impressive bio. Our next guest is Dr. Brian Amos, and he received his undergraduate degree at Cornell University and his master's and PhD from the University of Florida. Amos has authored several articles and presented at numerous conferences on election analytics and gerrymandering research. He has developed improvements to district mapping software, and he is currently assistant professor of political science at Wichita State University, where he has a current exhibition of maps showing gerrymandering in the Ulrich Museum of Art. His work is focused on the impact of geography on elections, and he has served as a consulting expert on state and federal cases challenging partisan gerrymanders in court. So first off, we're going to start off with Katie. We're going to start talking about the film, and I guess in general, how did the idea for filming this come to be? How did you get in contact with Magnolia, and what inspired you to make this a documentary?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you everybody for being here on a Saturday to want to talk about gerrymandering. I think everybody gets like an A+ in your civic duty today. But yeah, so and thanks for watching the film too, and just like for having this festival and being able to be so flexible and bringing it online. I am feeling very connected in a time when we're pretty isolated. So thanks to your leadership. So for us, starting from a Facebook post, you guys, I think everybody probably saw the movie. Hopefully that's not a spoiler alert. And we were just doing our thing, but there was this really great professor at Wayne State in Michigan named Kevin Deegan-Krause. And he, for fun, had just been going around the state holding meetings about gerrymandering, just because he felt like people should know about it and what it was. And we had ended up connecting with him, and the people who are making the film is a company actually called Arc Media. And Arc Media had read a book by David Daly that really talked about Project Rednap, which is highly featured in the film. And when they had read that, then they were like, oh, we want to like tell this story and make it come to life, just because we're not sure that everybody really understands all the connections related to this. But they also knew that they wanted to show the response from the American people on what are people doing when their voting power is reduced or taken away, or obviously, the will of the people isn't being followed. And so they were looking for stories to cover. They found the Wisconsin case first, and they'll tell you all day that they thought we were going to lose and that the court case was going to succeed. But Kevin, they were talking to because they had found him online posting videos about gerrymandering, and they're like, this guy is so great at explaining this really complicated issue. And Kevin was like, no, like, sure, I'm great, but like, you have to meet Voters Not Politicians. These are like the real deal. They're making it happen, and they're just so great. And once we met the filmmakers, they were like, we don't know if you guys are going to win, but you're entertaining. So let's see if we can start following you around. And internally, it was a little odd. You are working on a political campaign. You don't necessarily want, like, a political campaign. We had no idea what we were doing in. Like, from the beginning, we knew that we had never done this before and we were figuring it out. But when we all talked about it, we talked about how one of the hardest parts for us was, as regular citizens, not knowing how to navigate the political system. A lot of not only media, but other nonprofit organizations and the political establishment were all telling us this was silly, that regular people shouldn't try, that what we were doing was actually reckless. And it was really hard. It was hard to figure out, like, how do you open a bank account and how do you write constitutional language? So we internally decided, you know what, we do want to let these folks follow us around, just because we wish there was a video or a documentary for us to watch to see that it's possible, or to even just see how other people have navigated these really hard issues. So that's kind of how it ended up happening. And they followed us pretty early, actually. We started in November of 2016, and they probably started following us around in maybe February of 2017. So only a couple months later.
Wow, that's very interesting. Okay, the next question is, what sparked your interest in politics, and how did you land where you are?
Yeah, so I hate politics in general, like the whole voting for one person the whole like Democrat versus Republican thing has never been really big for me. My family never really talked about politics growing up. We're very Midwest, nice. We like don't talk about things that make people uncomfortable. But I always knew that voting and like doing your civic duty, that was just always a part of who I was. And I really paid attention to local politics just because I saw, especially being in the environmental space, how much it mattered. There was a drain commissioner, and I have no idea if Kansas has drain commissioners too, but in Michigan, we vote for our drain commissioners, which handle the drains. They handle your water quality. They handle different laws related to like real estate and water. And in Michigan, we're surrounded by the Great Lakes. Water is a huge natural resource, and where I live, we're very close to Lake Michigan. And so anyways, like I was like, oh, we should really make sure that who we're voting for is really qualified for this because it has really big ramifications. Anyways, none of my friends like thought that was cool. But I always kind of liked that element of government and politics, like making sure that we were being responsible for how we treat each other in the community and all of that. But as far as like volunteering for political campaigns or anything like that, it just never personally appealed to me. But I paid attention, I guess, is the important part. And in Michigan, when the Flint water crisis started happening, being somebody who is just out of college and watching the response from our elected officials, pretty much everybody just ended up like pointing the finger at everybody else, saying like, no, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. Oh, and the only thing that we could do was like give people water, and they needed water, but that was just such a little fix. And I kept going to work every day, just feeling like I don't want to live in a country where there's an entire city of poisoned children and nobody's doing anything about it. And like, I don't think I can keep like living with myself if I don't do something about it. So I knew that like with gerrymandering and with just how out of touch our elected officials were when it came to like listening to the people and listening to people's real concerns and taking those seriously, they just weren't afraid of losing our votes because they didn't need to be afraid of that. So I think I reached like a breaking point personally where I was just like, I've got to try and do something. When I made that Facebook post, I was not thinking it would lead to amending the Constitution. I was not thinking it would lead me in any kind of leadership position. I thought maybe like I'd find a couple other friends and then we'd go find like a group who was actually doing something about it and we'd start like volunteering with them. But once we started going and seeing how many people were active and excited, I realized that I wasn't actually as alone as I had thought I was. I always kind of felt like, why doesn't anybody care about this? But actually, we just weren't all connected, and that Facebook post allowed us for the first time to get connected to really talk about things like, let's go back to the basics of our elections. How do we elect our representatives? And how do we make that fair so that hopefully when people get into office, they can do the job that they were elected to do?
That's really awesome with that and all that stuff. And I really think it's really interesting how we're all coming together now virtually to get all of this talked about and start movements, maybe even virtually now. How are you working on things now in quarantine?
Completely, yeah. Well, the cool thing about our model was that it started online. So we never had, like, people would always be like, oh, can I stop by your office? And I was like, well, that's my living room, so please don't, or at least let me know first so I look presentable. But for the first 4 months, we never even met in person, which is a little weird because I was like, we didn't really use video calls that much. It was more through, like, Facebook and Google Docs, and I don't know if people know what Trello is, but, like, Trello. And so I kind of felt like maybe everybody was like trolling me, like maybe everybody was like a Russian spy who was like trying to hack the Michigan election or something. I was very paranoid. And I was like, I don't know if everybody's real. But what was nice about that is it was really flexible. So we had some people wanting to volunteer with us. And there was a veterinarian who reached out to me who was like, I can only volunteer from 4 a.m. till 7 a.m. twice a week because of the shifts that she worked. I was like, well, actually and so she was saying like, I don't think I can volunteer. It probably doesn't make sense to, but I was like, no, actually being a veterinarian, you've gone to a lot of school. I bet you know how to do research. Can you read all of these law reviews and like provide a summary online, even if it's at 4 a.m, we can all check it when we're awake later. And the internet really helped us just be able to be really flexible in how people could contribute, which I think was part of it. With a bunch of us never having done this before, it felt really intimidating, but when we could find things that were related to the expertise we did have, such as like she knew how to do research, even if it wasn't previously political research, or we had a wood carver who ended up cutting our 6,000 clipboards that we made. And if we didn't have a wood carver, we would have had to buy those, and it was so much more expensive. But being able to plug people in that way was really helpful. One of the things I kept thinking about throughout the campaign was that how hard this was. Like, it's already hard to stop people on the street and talk to them about gerrymandering. Like, everybody's like, as you saw in the movie a little bit, they're like, what? Why are you talking to me about this? So then, though, to have to also figure out how do you create an organization from scratch? How do you figure out campaign finance laws? How do you figure out like all of the little, there's so many rules for how you do this. And we kept thinking, we were building everything from scratch, and we just kept thinking, man, it shouldn't be this hard for citizens to be able to organize and use this power, because organizations or large lobbying firms, like, they have so many resources, they get paid to do this every single day, and it's not really fair that like the people who ultimately should also be able to access the system have so many more barriers. Like, we were told by our Secretary of State's office multiple times, normally you just pay somebody to do this, so can't you just go do that? I was like, well, we don't have a bank account, so no, we can't. We're actually just regular citizens trying to do this. So part of the people, which I'm wearing the people shirt today, part of after the election, what I wanted to do was take the lessons that we learned and the tools that we built and just make them more accessible, give them to other people trying to make change in their state, so that it would be at least a little bit easier. It's still going to be really hard, but at least this way you're not starting from scratch. You have a community that wants to support you. You have some of the tools that you may want to use while doing this. And you also have other people who actually believe in you from the beginning, because that was pretty hard for us too. So yeah, I think I answered your question.
Awesome. So the next question is, would you mind, you mentioned the people in your previous and what you just said. So would you mind explaining what the people is and what you have applied to it from learning about your first thing, voters, not politicians?
Sure. And if anybody's interested, you can go to thepeople.org, or you can text the people to 555-888. But basically, so far, we've really tried to, first we focus on like finding other Americans who felt frustrated with the political system, but weren't really sure how exactly to do something about it. And what's really cool is we found people like in all 50 states, and they came together and they actually wrote a document called the Declaration of the People. And they focused on what they no longer want to accept from our government, as well as what they want, what their visions for the country were if our country was living up fully to the values that it stands for. And the people that we found actually like matched the people of America. Like, it was like, it matched the demographics. So the percentage of young people and old people and Democrats and Republicans and independents and different economic income levels, all of that. And it was really a very inspiring way to kind of kick things off. And now what we're focused on is helping people organize. So we either help people find other people who care about gerrymandering in Wichita, for example. We could try and help you guys find other folks so that you can find your other dragon slayers that want to do something about it. Or we help connect them with tools and resources such as a plan. What does a campaign plan look like? I had no idea what that meant when we first started. My background was in business, so I knew a business plan, but I did not know what a campaign plan was. So we have like templates for that kind of stuff. We also have just like a large knowledge share of like what other organizations have expertise related to the thing that you're trying to do. So for us, Common Cause out of California, they actually had to try, I think, 4 different times to pass redistricting in California. And they were one of the first groups who actually started to help us out. And they said, hey, here's best practices. Here's what we learned. How can we help? And that meant so much to us. So we're trying to like help connect people in that way too. Right now we have active projects in New Hampshire and Florida and Virginia and Missouri. They're all working on very different things. And I think maybe Massachusetts is coming in San Diego and Grand Rapids in Michigan. But we're working every day to just help people find, like I said, other people, and then figure out how do I take this frustration and this urge I have to actually want to try and do something about this, and how do I start taking action and be successful on that.
That's amazing. That's so inspiring to like hear about all the different places nationally that this has gone. And wow. Okay. The next question is, as shown in the film, you were executive director of Voters Not Politicians, but are now executive director of The People. Can you describe what that organization is and how you transitioned between the two?
Totally. Yeah. So Voters Not Politicians is still, and I'm still like helping advise and stuff, but for me, when I started this, I kind of felt like part of the problem, and this is just my own personal, so like other people can totally have their own opinions, but I felt like part of the problem we were having with politics is that everybody was looking for a savior. They were either looking for like the political candidate who's going to come in and fix it all, or the political party that's going to come in and fix it all. And I just felt like with things like gerrymandering, or the amount of money that's in politics, or voter suppression, which is highlighted a little bit in the film, like with those really root causes of dysfunction, until we do something about that, I just don't know how successful anybody can really be. Again, personal opinion. And so at the end of this, like I got a ton of credit because I made the Facebook post, but like honestly, as you saw, even just a couple of the other people in Michigan, this would not have been possible if thousands of people hadn't decided that even though all of the odds said that they were stacked against us, that they were going to try, that they were going to put their time and their energy and their money and their creativity towards trying to make the world a better place and to make Michigan elections fair for everybody for generations to come. And like for signature gathering, we had to gather 315,654 signatures in 180 days. And like, I literally couldn't have done that by myself. Like I did the math and I was like, okay, so I quit my job and gather like 4,000 signatures a day. And I looked at how many people live in my city. There's only like 200,000 people total, let alone that all of those people are registered voters. So I was like, there's like literally no way. But that was what was so cool. And so at the end of the campaign, being the person who like, everybody talks about the Facebook post, which like was great, but like, again, I'm not that great. Like all of the people in our campaign were amazing. I just didn't want people to keep looking at me like I was the only one who made this possible. So that's why I knew that I wanted to at least take a step back in leadership to help some of the other people who are superstars like shine, just because like they were amazing. They're amazing people, and actually a lot of amazing women that I was like, they can do it too. And also I'm tired and I need a nap because it's been like a long couple of years. But our work continued 100%. So, winning to get a new way of drawing lines in place was huge. It's a huge part of the battle. But and the movie doesn't cover this as much, but our solution to gerrymandering was an independent citizens redistricting commission. And as a side note, one of our volunteers figured out that supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, the Mary Poppins song, is the same number of syllables as Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. So if you ever need a quick way to remember, it's the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. It's great. So that we'll have 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 5 independent voters. So elected partisan politicians actually can't apply to be one of the line drawers. They can attend the public meetings just like everybody else, but they will no longer be the ones who actually draw the lines. And we also changed the criteria, making gerrymandering illegal and making these lines not being allowed to be disproportionately advantaging Democrats or Republicans. The line should be drawn on how do we help this community actually get representation in our state capital, which for us is Lansing, Michigan, and in Washington, D.C. from these representatives. But in order for those lines to be drawn that way, the people of Michigan actually have to say what they want. They have to say, here is how I want my community represented. Here are the things that aren't happening right now. Like maybe it is water. If it was Flint, I'm sure it would be like, hey, our water in schools right now are crumbling. So in our school district maybe isn't in one city. I know probably the younger folks in here, you guys haven't bought houses most likely yet. So like school districts are probably not a thing a ton of like have really thought about, but school districts often aren't just in one city. And so a lot of times school districts will be in like 4 different congressional districts. So if you actually have a problem with your school, you're having to go and try and get attention of 4 different representatives, hoping one of them will pay attention to you, even though you probably only represent like less than 1% of the people that they represent. So like those kind of things really matter when it comes to people trying to actually advocate for what they need. But like now that this process has changed, the 9.9 million people that live in Michigan have never gotten to be in these rooms. These doors that were previously closed, people weren't in those rooms. They didn't get a say. And for the first time ever, people do get a say. And so Voters Not Politicians is working really hard on how do we get people to apply for this, who would be great listeners, who would be probably somebody like the professor right here, who can like look at maps and who can look at data and be objective. And then how do we also help the people of Michigan know that they need to attend these public meetings, that they need to comment online and make sure that their communities are represented. And the other part that Voters Not Politicians is focused on is there were some lawsuits filed immediately after we passed in Michigan, which was expected. Again, so far the courts have dismissed them without merit. It was just heard in the circuit court on St. Patrick's Day, actually. And depending on how that goes, it could be appealed to the federal Supreme Court, but the federal Supreme Court doesn't necessarily have to hear it. They could just dismiss it. But for now, our state is still very focused on how do we get people to apply and how do we get people to make sure that they can actually participate in this process. And the other cool thing I will say is that now that there were thousands of us for the first time who ever got politically involved, a bunch of people are running for office. They're like running for local school boards. They are starting their own campaigns. They're starting local city resolutions when it comes to districting. They're somebody, I don't know if everybody knows what ranked choice voting is, but there's a group that's starting to try and do ranked choice voting here in Michigan, all because they now know that they do have more power than they previously thought. And so Voters Not Politicians is helping people in Michigan continue to get connected that way too.
Awesome. So I know that there are questions in the chat and we will address them once we're done with all of our interviews, but we will get to them, I promise. So with the people, how has that really changed with Voters Not Politicians to the people?
Yeah, we chat, we collaborate. We just did a shared event together a couple weeks ago. But I think their focus is very much Michigan and how do we make sure Michigan is doing well, and our focus is very much like how do we just help other people be able to make change in their states. So like if somebody's working on a redistricting initiative and they are trying to figure out like the petition process, Jamie Lyons-Eddy, who's in the movie a little bit, she's amazing. She was our state field director. I love her. Like I'll maybe call her up and be like, hey, Jamie, do you have an extra half an hour to talk to these folks in Oklahoma trying to gather signatures to end gerrymandering, because she's like a really great resource. So like we like work together that way. And then if I see funding opportunities that make sense for just within Michigan, then I let them know. If they hear about opportunities that are outside of their scope, whether it's national or an issue they don't deal with, but we do, then they'll send them our way. It's been very cool. It's all very good. It just like, with organizations, you want a really specific focus in what you're like doing, just so that you can do that really well. And that's kind of why we decided to be like, okay, let's make sure, because, you know, just because we passed this, Michigan needs a lot more work still. Like let's make sure Michigan is a focus, but then let's also allow ourselves to like give really quality help to people outside of Michigan.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So, when you were working with Voters Not Politicians and were very like actively involved in that, was there a moment, especially like during the time that was filmed, that was the peak challenge, the most challenging part of this experience that was just very difficult to handle?
I do think it probably was the part that got captured in the film of the Supreme Court. The part that the film doesn't explain is for the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court was going to kick us off saying that like ending gerrymandering through the citizen-led ballot initiative was like too complicated. Like the people of Michigan are not smart enough basically to be able to possibly understand voting on something that is this complex, was like their continued argument. Which I always thought was like a very funny argument. Like I was like, cool, our government is telling us we're dumb. Great. Like that's what they are arguing in court. But if they were to have ruled and said, yeah, no, this isn't like an appropriate topic that can be, the ballot initiative can be used, we were done. Like you're just kicked off the ballot. There's nowhere you can appeal. It doesn't go to the federal Supreme Court. It just stays in the state, which I like didn't know until I was doing this. And the judges, 5 of them, so our judges in Michigan run for office, and they run through a political party. Like a political party nominates them, and then they can run, even though they run nonpartisan on the ballot, which is another thing that I didn't know until I was doing this, and I found very disturbing, because I'm like, are they supposed to be impartial? What is going on? But 5 of them had used the same campaign finance chair. So that's the person, like, while you're running for office, they like make sure that all of your campaign money is being spent the right way. Their campaign finance chair for 5 of them was the wife of the person bringing the lawsuit against us. So like the wife of the person bringing the lawsuit against us is employed by 5 of the people sitting on this court. And, you know, one of the judges had said, like, look, I understand that this obviously looks bad, but I'm telling you, I will be impartial. But at the same time, it's like, okay, can we believe that? And there's really nothing you can do. You can ask them to recuse themselves, but the way that and recuse themselves means like they're not going to hear the case. They would just like sit on the sidelines, and the other judges would, except you would be asking 5 out of 7 of the people to do that. So it was like this very hard moment where, even though we felt like the law was 100% on our side, even though we felt like we were heard, you know, we made our arguments well, really at the end of the day, those 7 people have all of the power, regardless of what anything else we do. There was nothing else we could do. And I think just thinking about all of that hard work that thousands of people had done, and like just trying to think about like, man, did we take enough time when we wrote our language? Did we make the right calls? Are the commas in the right place? Like literally constitutional amendments had been thrown out because of font, because of the type of font people had used before. Like this had happened in Michigan. I was just like feeling the weight of that, because with everything else, there was something we could do. We could, you know, go and gather more signatures. We could go knock a couple more doors. We could go and try and raise more money. But with this, it just was kind of at that point of like, there was nothing else we could do besides show that we were real people. And we actually ended up doing that. Like they didn't quite show this, but the courtroom was not only full, but we had a 300-person rally outside of the Supreme Court too, just saying like, hey, just let us vote on this. Because the whole argument was like, do we get to vote on this or not? And we're like, let us vote on this. And what's really cool is the deciding judge, who did end up ruling impartially. She followed the Constitution, not what the political party wanted her to do. We got to talk to her afterwards, and she said the only day that the Michigan Supreme Court was full all session in 2018 was that day. And she's like, and don't think we don't notice that. Like we know when a court is empty versus when it's full. And to me, I took that as like, it mattered that we showed up. It mattered that we showed that real people were being impacted and real people were paying attention.
That's cool. So next we will move to Brian's questions, or Dr. Amos's questions. And we will say, Dr. Amos, how has this film influenced or changed your opinions on gerrymandering?
Well, first of all, thank you both for inviting me, Julia and Lauren. And thanks, Katie, for being here for this, and the rest of you for watching. It's interesting, Katie, you mentioned that the filmmakers were inspired by Dave Daly's book. Like that whole introductory section about red map and what gerrymandering is seems to come like straight from that book. And Ari Berman gets interviewed a lot, and you can see a lot of like the voter identification laws section of the movie seems to be pulled straight from his book. So a lot of that stuff, you can see where that's coming from. But I thought the kind of behind the scenes stuff with Katie's campaign and with Ruth and Nick, the husband and wife lawyer pair, you know, what they went through, because I studied redistricting. So following the Wisconsin case, you know, I was following that closely, and I knew that something was going on in Michigan along with some other states. But, you know, the movie was not exaggerating how hard it is to get a ballot initiative, you know, get all those signatures you need without paying people to do it. Like when I teach state and local politics and I map out what the process is for ballot initiative, it's like, well, you get somebody to get $3 million and then you can pay people and then you're on the ballot. Like this is really the exception to the rule. So I kind of missed that backstory when it came to the 2018 elections. So that it was eye-opening, that whole story.
So, Dr. Amos, I was wondering, how do you think this film could be applied to Wichita, or how does gerrymandering apply to Kansas or other states in the country that you think, I mean, I'm not saying we can make a difference in one Zoom call, but it would be interesting to start a conversation about it. How does this work in Kansas?
So the big downer, I'm going to rain on the parade a little bit, is that Michigan has the ballot initiative where you collect a bunch of signatures, you can kind of go around the legislature and pass a constitutional amendment. We don't have that in Kansas. So if we do want a constitutional amendment, we have to convince the legislature to pass it. And for obvious reasons, there's not a strong incentive for the legislature to do that, give up that power. And if you look at states that have strong independent commissions, Michigan just passed it, Colorado just passed it, California and Arizona have had it for a while. They all went through ballot initiatives so they could go around the legislature. On the flip side of things, we are different than Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio, Pennsylvania, in that we're not really a swing state. I mean, in a perfect storm of a wave election and a certain candidate matchup, we can get Laura Kelly. We can get a Democrat elected statewide. But even after 2018, we still have supermajorities of Republicans in the state House and the state Senate. So I guess the upside of that is there's not a strong incentive to gerrymander. There's not a huge incentive to squeeze out that extra seat. And Democrats on the flip side might be kind of resigned to the idea that we're going to be in the minority for the foreseeable future. So they might accept, just draw me a good district and I'm fine with that. So there might be compromise between the parties. Where things might get messy is, so for a long time we've had 4 Republicans representing us in the US House, but in 2018, Sharice Davids won the Kansas City district, and by a pretty comfortable margin too. So that might be where we see a battle, and we now have a Republican legislature, we have a Democratic governor, so they might kind of go at each other there. So, Laura Kelly could veto whatever the Republicans pass, and I guess going back 10 years ago, actually Republicans kind of deadlocked among themselves. So we do have court-drawn districts right now. It's not really a gerrymander. So that might be the end result again in a couple years from now. We might see some sort of compromise be struck between the Democrats and the Republicans, or again, if Republicans have veto-proof majorities or they're able to swing some Democrats to agree to whatever map they pass, we could see that again. So a little bit of a doubter. I mean, if we were to convince the legislature to do something about gerrymandering, we'd have to do it next year in the legislative session. It's a little too late this year to do that. But yeah.
I'll just add really quick though, Virginia is an example where the legislature did actually just end up passing something that'll go to the voters. So, putting enough pressure out there, talking about it, it's definitely harder and it's not usually as great of a solution, but there are other states that are working with legislators to do it too.
Yeah, so we've seen some states like flip party control, and then they're like, okay, let's put protections in place. And like Ohio put in protections, some protections on gerrymandering as well through the legislature. But again, they tend to be a little bit weaker than like what Michigan ended up having.
Yeah, so that's all really interesting to us because, to be very honest, we are not very political people either. And we're really happy that we both have both of you guys here to kind of answer our questions. And so I guess in general, if you just had, this is a question that could be for both of you. What do people have to gain from knowing what gerrymandering is and how it could affect them?
I think the movie said it well. Like once people know the topic, if it gets on the ballot, it usually succeeds. It's getting it onto the ballot that's the difficult part. but it's not something a lot of people are familiar with. Yeah, Katie, I guess you've actually done this.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so gerrymandering isn't just about like what party wins too. It is about the concept of representation. And in America, like starting with our Declaration of Independence, we are forging out to have a country where our government is actually responsive and responsible to the people that it's governing, all of us. The reason we elect representatives, the reason we even have districts, why we've chosen to have that type of government is that theoretically, we're electing somebody who actually understands our community, who's going to represent our best interests in our state capitals and then in Washington, D.C. And when you change gerrymandering or the rules for how the lines are drawn, there's a couple different ways that you change it. You know, it's who draws the lines, what are the ways that they draw the lines, and what's the process they use for drawing the lines. But one of the things that I think is not as emphasized in the movie, but that in Michigan, like was on the top of a lot of voters' minds, is it also protects incumbents, which means like the people in office. So let's say that like Lauren, I was in office and nobody really liked me, but I get to draw the lines and you're running against me. You're like this young, just out of high school. You're like, everybody's like, oh my gosh, Lauren is going to do such a great job representing us. But I see that and I'm paying attention. And you know, maybe you run the first time and you get a little bit of, you know, now people know who you are. And I'm like, uh-oh, I'm worried. Well, now that I'm in office and it's a year ending in 0, it's 2020, and I know Lauren's probably going to be running again in 2022 to try and unseat me, I'm going to Google where Lauren's house is, and I'm going to draw the map literally around her house so that if she even tries to run against me, and it depends on the state. In Michigan, you don't have to live in your district in order to run, but if she is, then I'm going to run just a bunch of attack ads saying, Lauren doesn't even live in this district, why would she represent us? Because I know who you are, and I have the power because I get to choose who the voters are that I want in my district. And so what you see is when you change gerrymandering, you actually tend to get younger and more diverse people into office, even if it's not changing parties. So even if it's still a Democrat getting elected or it's still a Republican getting elected, younger and newer people do, because that incumbent who's been there forever, who always makes sure that they're going to be safe, no longer has that luxury of being able to personally pick who their voters are going to be, which when it comes to our votes and our communities, you want somebody who's representing you. Now, sometimes people have been in office are great, and maybe you would still vote for them, but not being able to have those people afraid of losing your vote, or them being so comfortable that I know I'm going to make it through the primary because I've got name recognition, and I know that a Democrat's going to win this district, or I know that a Republican's going to win this district. That's dangerous. That's dangerous because then decisions get made that aren't in line with us. And it also makes it so that other people who have other things that the politician wants that will influence them, whether it's money or a job for when they're getting out of office or working on like a pet piece of legislation they really care about, they then somehow have way more influence than we, the people who are actually paying their salaries with our tax dollars, do. And in Michigan, which I just don't know Kansas's issues as much, I'm sure there have been at least a few things that don't line up or weren't decisions that were made that weren't in the best interest of everybody. In Michigan, what that ended up meaning was literally 12 people died. They died because of their water source, and nobody purposely wanted that to happen, but decisions were made based off of money and making sure that people could take away local control instead of what's in the best interest of the people. And then also when the people were trying to raise the issue, nobody really took them seriously, and they knew that they could basically continue to lie and cover up that there was an actual issue because they didn't want to lose their job from their boss. And like that's very real. It's human life, it's quality of schools, it's roads, it's water, it's all those things that we do have government for, which are very good reasons. And I think particularly right now, as we're dealing with like a worldwide pandemic, like knowing that your elected officials are going to work every day really worried and thinking about how do I deliver the best results for my people, it's sad that you might even have to question that depending on where you live. And there are a lot of communities, I think, in the United States where they have had representatives who clearly are not just looking out for the best interest of people. And now that it like matters more than ever, building that trust or being able to have that trust, it probably adds to the amount of like fear that you're feeling. And it could also impact their ability to now compromise if they might need to compromise with people in a different party or people they don't like or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that could all really relate to like voter voter rights and stuff like that, could we maybe talk about how, like as a young person, I know that I'm really looking forward to voting, but knowing that other people may not have the same ability as me to vote, that's like a very honest concern. And I think maybe to start to wrap this conversation up before the Q&A, I was wondering if you guys could just maybe talk about how like intersectional voting and voter rights are important. And I think it definitely relates to like intersectional feminism, making sure everybody is equal and having the same rights as everybody else. Would you be able to comment?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the movie went into some of it a little bit. Again, I mentioned Ari Berman, he was interviewed throughout the movie, touches on a lot of this. And, you know, the general trend over the past few decades has been expanding the ways you can vote. So early voting, no excuse absentee. Some states have moved to all mail balloting. And the way it works out is that some types of people or some groups of people use these different forms of voting differently. So traditionally it's been, you know, older people tend to use absentee voting. In states with large African-American communities, they tend to use early voting a little bit more, and especially on Sundays. So the movie mentions the Souls to the Polls movement, where kind of church groups go together to vote early. And that is where we've seen kind of attacks on what had been expansions, kind of reducing back down voting rights or ways to vote. And actually, I guess now with coronavirus, we are seeing the question of whether we should move to all mail balloting, or at least send everybody a ballot right away. Like Wisconsin is kind of having a fight over this right now, where they've got a state Supreme Court race going on, and they're nonpartisan technically, but it's clear that there's a Republican candidate or Democratic candidate. And, you know, the Democratic governor wants mail ballots going out to everybody. The Republican legislature is trying to stop that. Yeah, it's unfortunate that there are these trends, and then because of those trends, certain methods of voting get targeted. And yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, and I just add, so first of all, I think it's like I feel like that is not a question I was asking when I was a high school senior. So like, I just want to say that is awesome. And it makes me like feel very hopeful. And I think it's like so responsible of you guys to even be thinking about that. Not before you've even been able to vote the first time. And there are real barriers, as the movie highlights, but there are real solutions too. And I know you guys aren't in college yet, but colleges can often be really crazy, especially if there's really early voting requirements, like if you have to register to vote, if you're not automatically registered to vote, if you can't vote on campus, if you have to show up in person the first time you vote. In Michigan, that's how it used to be. We just changed it. And we've only had the primaries since, but our primaries are actually up like over 200% that they've ever been, because now you can register the same day to vote, and you can do no reason absentee. So like, no matter who you are, it used to be that you had to like technically have a reason. So you could just mail it in. I think that example of Wisconsin, there's a political decision being made when people's lives could be at stake, whether they want to fulfill their civic duty by doing it through mail or not. Like that is such a clear example of why these issues are so urgent to fix. The census is upon us. If not everybody has filled out your census, make sure you do. We only have to do it once every 10 years, one per household. So big census fan. But what's kind of cool is that the census is somewhat accurate. You hope it is. There's still hard to reach communities, but you can look at the data of who is voting and who lives in our state and who's eligible to vote. And you can usually kind of see what communities are being left out. And who doesn't have access. And there are a lot of really great researchers and people and organizations who really try and look at this already. So I think, you know, going to those organizations, going to those places, that definitely matters. But really taking the time to figure out why. Like I know North Dakota with Native American populations, they don't all have individual home addresses. And for registering to vote, they wanted you to have a physical address. You couldn't have a P.O. box. They all had P.O. boxes at the end of their reservation. And so therefore a law that's written that way just ignores the Native American population who literally do not live in a place where they have a physical address. And those things matter a lot. And communities like Native Americans, who were one of the last communities to be able to even register to vote, even though they lived in this country before us, like that's, they already are discouraged. So then that's another barrier of like, well, clearly you guys don't care about me, so why should I care about you? And that's where I think some people who are concerned like yourself can make a real difference in being able to help fight and bring awareness, but also just show up to the table and say, I want to make sure that my neighbors can vote too. I want to make sure that everybody in my state has access to an equal ballot. There's the Vote at Home Institute, if that's like a top of mind issue for mailing ballots. They have a great guide for each state and what that looks like. The Voting Rights Lab is another one, but there's a lot of really great research that's been done on these issues. And what it really comes down to is they need people, and they need people demanding and showing that they care. Your Secretary of State is one of the most important people. I mean, I guess it depends state by state, but almost in every single state, Secretary of State handled all the elections. They handle the voter file, they handle making sure how voter registration happens. And so not only being educated and informed on who is that, but show up to their town halls and ask them some of those tough questions of saying, you know what, these people don't even have access to voting. Why is that? You can also work with state representatives, but one of the things that I learned throughout this whole process, there was another moment in the very beginning where all these groups were like, you don't have any money, what are you doing? And I knew we had people though. And I was talking to a woman named Dora Rodriguez-Sharkey, she's amazing. And I was like, Dora, I just feel like maybe everybody's right. Like maybe this is too big. Maybe there's like, we don't have any money. We don't have enough influence. And she said, you know what? There's one thing that I've learned over the years that yes, one person in a room looks really lonely. But then you get 2, and then you get 3, and then you get 10 and 100 and 1,000. And soon enough, they can't ignore you. There are too many of you saying, we care about this and we're not going away. We're going to continue to care about this. And they have to deal with it. Because nobody wants themselves looking bad, like there's a bunch of people are making angry or that they're suppressing people. And I personally think that's the next step of how do we get more accountability. Maybe it's being able to elect a different person, but maybe it's also going to that person and saying, hey, these are real lives, these are real issues, we really do care. And being able to advocate in that way, I think is, yeah, important and something that we can each do.
That's cool. So as for my last question before we transition, how do you guys, since this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and we do want to promote intersectional voting, how do you guys feel about the 19th Amendment not including everyone in that? And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was it that really like included everyone in this, and just the future of what that is and how we celebrate it?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that I guess you phrased it, because sort of the opposite argument was going on when there was a guarantee of voting based on race, since that came first, although technically it didn't have teeth until the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. So in some ways it kind of righted a weakness of what had come before, in that gender wasn't included in the original, in the Civil War amendments.
I think there's a controversy definitely going on, because I think there's like a controversy that the 19th Amendment was definitely for women got the right to vote during that time, but then also that, you know, not too many other people got the right to vote. That didn't include Black women or anybody else. So I guess my question is, how can we continue to acknowledge this 100th anniversary of this amendment correctly? How should we go about this? And that's kind of a big question.
Well, I mean, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were key to I mean, both African Americans, African American women being able to vote. I mean, especially in the South, and especially some deep South states, there's essentially no voting by those groups. And the Voting Rights Act still exists, but with Shelby County versus Holder earlier this decade, they did kind of gut some of the protections that these groups have, where prior to Shelby County versus Holder, with redistricting, for example, these states that had a legacy of discrimination had to pre-clear changes to election laws or changes to maps with the federal government before they took effect. The change was that the formula that determined which states or counties had to follow those rules, it was based on things that had happened in the 60s and 70s. The Supreme Court ruled that those were out of date and that those would need to be updated if they wanted to continue to have jurisdictions covered by that. And you know, the U.S. House, so especially the Democrats in the U.S. House, have tried to push for an update to that formula so that groups are federally protected. To, you know, now the process is a new law goes into effect, it has to be challenged in court, and then it can be struck down. You know, again, prior to that, it had to be approved, and then it could go into effect. It would be amazing if a new formula did go into effect, because we do see racial gerrymandering happening. You know, maps are being struck down, election laws are being struck down. It would be nice if that could be done preemptively. Whether or not there is a political will to do that is another question, but it would be great, you know, as a kind of a 100th anniversary celebration, if those protections were strengthened again, or at least, you know, at least went back to what they were 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think for me, I do not claim to be an expert here at all. But the way I've tried to think about it, and again, would not say that I'm an expert in any way, but I think acknowledging the reality of history is super important. It's very important to not try and act like something was better than it was. But I also feel like celebrating and figuring out what are the ways we move forward and make it better is also like very, very important, because I personally sometimes see like friends getting stuck in only the negative, and that doesn't help anybody. It does not help anybody to just talk about how crappy we were and have been as a country. Like, it is extremely important to acknowledge it and to not make it not discussable. But I think also there are real things that we can do right now today that will matter, and more people will get access to the right to vote. And if we aren't actually taking the action part of that just as seriously, then we probably aren't doing our duty anyways. I think a lot about what I like about America is that we've continued to add amendments that have increased people's rights to vote. Now the Voting Rights Act has been like, yes, skewered and all of that, so that is not a good direction. But the thing is, though, we're constantly striving to be that more perfect union. And the only way that any of that has happened is because people got involved and started social movements and refused to be ignored. And they refused to let our government live in the past, even though it still kind of was like catching up to many times. And that's really real. And so maybe even personally looking in your community, and again, trying to go and find some of those communities who have been left out of the table and making sure they're at the table now, making sure that you're going and figuring out what are the issues that are impacting them the most, and how can I go be an ally, or how can I go help fight and make sure that this isn't being ignored anymore. It will matter. It will be, I think, the only way that it will change, because the people in office right now, probably they got elected based on the current system. So they don't have a lot of incentive to change the system, because maybe they want to get elected then. Maybe they still would, but they might not be looking for that. Yet they still represent the people in those districts. And I think having conversations about that, having conversations that include, okay, let's look right now today too, and how are we going to continue this legacy of increasing the amount of participation, and how are we going to acknowledge our past and where we haven't been, but also know that this is our country. We are the people of our country, and we have every right, and I would personally say our civic duty is to make sure that we are creating it to be even better for every American, not just a few.
I agree, and I think that's very good. Like, what you both said is awesome. So now we will transition to our audience Q&A portion. Lauren and I will alternate asking questions that you submit in the chat box. We've been looking at your questions during this, and I think we'll start with Alan Lefebvre. His question, Katie, do your orgs provide, or ORGs provide groups in other states with language for redistricting ballot initiatives like ALEC does for GOP legislators?
Yeah, we don't. There are other groups that do. Like, I know that depending on what the issue is, there's sample or example language or with best practices. If you look at a lot of organizations like even like the League of Women Voters or the NAACP, on their websites, oftentimes with different issues like gerrymandering, they'll say, here's the types of things we're looking for in language. I personally take an approach where I think the people of one state should be crafting the language no matter what. Now, learning best practices, looking at the data to see what's impactful, what are the consequences, super important. Don't like we did a ton of that. We did a ton of research on every state that had anything that wasn't politicians drawing their lines. But what we did, and the movie kind of talks about this, but it's actually my favorite part, we realized pretty quickly that we had this policy team, anybody could be a part of it, but part of the problem with gerrymandering was that these laws and things are written behind closed doors by like only a few people, even though they end up impacting millions. And we're like, well, we're still technically just a group of people like online in a back room, like writing some stuff in what we think is great, but like, how do we really know if that's what the people of Michigan want? So we went and did these town halls, which they highlighted a bit, and we did 33 in 33 days. In Michigan, we have 14 congressional districts, so we went to each of those at least twice, and then we did some online and tried to make sure we did some in different languages to reach more different people in Michigan. But at those, we had surveys and questions that we asked people, asking them their preference. You know, do you want politicians drawing these lines? If not politicians, who should? Should they have a high school diploma? Does that matter? Should they all be from the same part of the state? Do you want lobbyists drawing these lines? And like, we asked people a bunch of those different things so that we could understand what was really popular and what people's concerns were, so that our solution was always rooted in like what Michigan wanted. And then we also had to, of course, look at like what's legal and what's going to make sure that we're addressing these issues. And so our organization right now, we have like an example of how we did that policy process with those town halls that we will help your organization or your group of concerned citizens craft, so that if you like that type of model, we can help make sure that you're navigating those loopholes. But we can also connect you with other organizations who might have similar type of language. But us ourselves, we don't, I personally don't like saying like, oh, I know the right solution and it has to be this way. It's just not how I roll.
So we have another question from Mama Film. Was it distracting or challenging to film the documentary while you were also running a whole campaign?
We did think about that a lot, but honestly, the documentary crew was really conscious of that. They were like hardly ever asking us to do anything above and beyond. And if we were ever like, we're too busy focused on this, they wouldn't. It's weird having cameras follow you around all the time. I mean, and they weren't there all of the time. They flew to Michigan, you know, when they knew that we had big stuff going on. But honestly, that was a learning curve in general, like having to get comfortable in front of press. I think it shows it a couple times, but any big event we did, I would be like immediately surrounded by like 20 different news crews or whatever. So the fact that these people, I felt like at least weren't rooting for us to fail. Like weren't necessarily rooting for us to win. I think they thought they could make an interesting movie either way, but like at least they weren't, we quickly established like, okay, like this isn't coming out till afterwards. So I'm just going to be like, I could feel comfortable being honest in front of them 100%, not like worrying like something I was going to say was going to cause some controversy in the newspaper or something on how we were acting. So in that part, it wasn't. And in some ways, in the beginning, it was actually kind of helpful because that's when everybody was like, you guys are so silly for trying to do this. Like, you're so naive. You're so, like, you know, wishful or whatever. And so to have, like, this national documentary crew actually taking interest in us, I think it felt like, you know, maybe like we should be doing this. Like, maybe there's at least somebody who thinks that, like, it's worthwhile and that what we're doing might matter one day. So in that way, it was kind of like nice in the beginning.
Awesome. So the next question comes from Hannah Hecox, and it says, question from my dad to Katie. Are you interested in running for office or some kind of city leadership position?
Thank you. Right now I'm not, but mostly because I think I really feel like people don't know how amazing they are. Like I just saw that all the time, and that might sound a little weird or silly, but like I constantly saw all these people who were like so caring. They thought about the world all of the time. They thought about these massive issues all the time. Yet for whatever reason, like in themselves, they felt like they couldn't make a difference, or the problem was too hard or whatever. And so like my favorite part of the campaign was being like, just so you know, you're amazing and you are the reason this is happening. Because people would always come up to me, they're like, sorry, I only gathered 10 signatures. And I was like, what do you mean, sorry? You gathered 10 signatures, which now makes us that much closer to actually amending the freaking Constitution, which is going to help voters for decades have like a better life here in Michigan. And so for right now, I think like helping other people in other communities, and also just helping make sure that we're fixing the system so that like, if one day I felt like that you could get elected and you could actually focus on governing and not like being political, that would probably be it. And then I'd probably do drain commissioner because I'm obsessed with drain commissioner. But for right now, I'm much like, I don't like saying like, when people are like, oh, how do you feel about this? Like my answers would all be like, I would ask the constituents and I would see what they want. Like that would just always be it. And I don't think you win doing that right now. Maybe one day though.
This may be a little off course, but what's the appeal of drain commissioner?
I think for me, it's just like such an important job in Michigan in particular with the Great Lakes that like, just to, and my original degree was in sustainable business, which is like environmental, social oriented business practices. To know that you could help design a community to like handle water issues for like preparing for the next like decades, hopefully. I just think I like that kind of stuff. I like thinking about like, okay, how do we help design this to think about future generations? Yeah,
that sounds like a cool job.
Yeah, exactly. It totally is.
Yeah. So our next question that we have for you is, besides Magnolia Pictures' current push, are there other efforts to get this film seen and out there?
Yeah, so participant media they're working with, and like originally they had this plan where they were going to go into a couple different states and do like really extensive education programs, especially states that either have like active redistricting campaigns or where they're have independent citizen redistricting commissions and they need people to like apply for them. That's like, they're like figuring out what does that look like still in a like digital organizing space instead of in person. So I think they're figuring that out, but they are also just still looking for other organizations that want to partner who think that this can be a useful tool in helping. So that's all that I know about. I've learned so much about movies. And reality TV, I feel like, even though that's very different than documentaries, like the amount of stuff they film versus how much made it in the movie, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. But yeah, beyond that, sorry, answering the question, I'm not sure. I hope more people try and push it out. I know that there's been some different people who've like shown it. I think I wouldn't be surprised if Arnold Schwarzenegger, since he's in the movie, star in a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, pretty stoked. I wouldn't be surprised if like he tweets about it or something. I mean, I hope he does, but yeah, I could see like that kind of stuff, but I don't know if they have any other big plans for it. It was supposed to go into theaters, but now it's like doing the online theater thing. So, you know, maybe more people will see it than they would have. Maybe not. I hope they do, just so that they know that they can make change. But
so for the next question, I'll pose it for the both of you. It's from Hannah. And how do you have a conversation with or face those who do not believe in the importance of voting, especially during this time?
I can go first if that's helpful. So I have a story. I'm a big story person. So I was gathering signatures for redistricting, and to sign a petition in Michigan, you have to be a registered voter. And so went up to this group of younger folks, and I was like, hey, do you want to sign this petition? I started with, are you a registered voter? Because it's kind of like, okay, let's get that out of the way. The first kid said like, no. And I was like, hey, why not? And he was like, well, have you heard about gerrymandering? And I was like, funny that you say that. Yes, I have heard about gerrymandering, and that is what this petition is. And he was so excited that it was on that he made all of his friends who were registered to vote sign it. And then he told me he'd go and get registered and vote for it. I hope that he actually did. But I share that story because I think that, I mean, there's probably some people who just don't care about voting because they don't care about voting. But I also think that it's a lot of people feel like it will not matter if they vote either way. Like they feel like my voice doesn't matter, my one vote doesn't count, like that's why I don't want to participate. And that's actually why I think these solutions coming from the people of the community and these systemic, like how do we get back to basics and make sure that people can feel like, first of all, that they can trust the voting systems that we have, but also that like when they show up, it can make a difference. I think those are some of the keys to helping change that attitude. And honestly, I don't blame some people, especially those communities that have been suppressed year after year after year for feeling like their votes don't matter, because things like gerrymandering, it's not that their votes don't matter, especially in like local elections, but like there are people who spend a lot of time and energy and money on making sure that their votes wouldn't count as much as they should, or that their voices wouldn't count as much as they should, which encourages me to go back to like, we can do stuff about that. And that's what I would kind of tell them too, of like, you know what, like I'd ask them, I'd start with asking them, you know, like, why don't you care? And again, if it ends up being like, I just don't think it makes a difference, I would go back to like, well, but let's make a difference. Like, let's, you know, there are actually ways that we can change that. And I'm working on that, or, you know, I personally am, but if you are too, like I'm working on that and here's how you could help or whatever. Cause sometimes I think people, this is the other thing I learned about being a leader in the campaign, being the one who wasn't afraid to say, I think we can do this, mattered way more than I ever would have thought it would. There were a lot of people who they kind of wanted to believe, but they weren't willing to be the person who was like sticking their neck out that much. And by me doing that, they felt a little bit safer to dream big dreams and feel like we could live in a place where our votes count more.
Yeah, good.
You go ahead.
Yeah, so there's kind of a classic study that an economist did. And economists are all about, you know, cost versus benefit. Any action I'm going to do, I'm going to maximize the benefit for myself. So he like turned his attention to voting, and the thought was, well, why should I vote? You know, where will there be a benefit for me voting versus not voting? Well, when I'm like the key pivotal vote. Like if I didn't vote, the person who I wanted to vote wouldn't win, but if I did vote, they would win. And his conclusion was that there's no reason you should vote. You're never going to be that one vote that tilts you over. But obviously everybody, you know, lots of people do vote. So people go beyond that sort of thought process of, well, being that one key pivotal vote is what matters. And kind of the conclusion, you know, that kicked off decades of research about why do people vote? Why do some people not vote? And a lot of it, I think, goes back to what Katie was saying. There's the idea of community, kind of that feeling of being part of something or civic duty. And, you know, you do actually become more likely to be that pivotal vote if you're talking about local issues, if you're voting on the city level or the kind of neighborhood level. So bringing people in on an organizational level there can also be an influence. You know, a lot of people only pay attention to national politics. And if you're here in Kansas, you know, why would you think so much about it? But if you can draw people into that kind of more local level, down to your friend group level, I think things can change. You can influence people to vote.
That's awesome. Okay, so I think Ivo from the Netherlands kind of asked a similar question, and but we could still talk about it. Obviously, elections in the US are very different from other countries, including the Netherlands. I personally don't know the voting system in the Netherlands, but why do you both think that it's still possible that this system where votes are thrown away is still the way to go? So in general, just our voting system, why do you still have hope in it?
I mean, so I'm not sure if you did get to see the movie or not, but I think that people power is still really real. I think one of the questions I personally was struggling with was, I was always that person asking my friends, I guess they're my people. People, if they were registered to vote, if they were going to show up to the primary election, if they're going to show up to the local city election, I was always that friend. And I think I was having this moment throughout the whole thing of like, is democracy even worth it? Like as I'm fighting this fight, like I think I always thought like, okay, if we're able to do this in the right way, if we don't have to sell out, if we don't have to compromise on like, like whatever kind of political situations, if we can be nonpartisan, if we can do all these things, then maybe democracy is still alive and maybe it's still good that we vote. And because if not, then I'm going to leave my friends alone and stop bugging them. I'll probably still vote, but I'll let them off the hook because it's not still real. And the thing that I experienced was there was so much community in organizing and fighting to make our state better. And that's what I think our voting system allows us to do. It does allow people to come together to advocate, to fight for your local city issue. It allows you to have one person to go and kind of hold accountable. Again, it's hard to do that right now, but I think there are solutions to make it so that responsiveness increases and that the other influences don't. And that ability, I personally find very inspiring, but also through this process saw that it matters. It matters a lot. People not only felt purpose, but they also finally felt like they could do something about these really big issues and have continued to then use that power. I just think because there's so much attention paid to the national elections that a lot of Americans have moved away from being able to pay attention at that really super local level. And so it's a little bit on us too, to say even if the news is only ever talking about what's happening for the presidential race, what is going on at home and what are the changes I can make there? Because there's a lot of cool experiments too. They always call the states the what is it? The lab of democracy.
Laboratories of democracy.
Laboratories for democracy. Thank you. And participatory budgeting, I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but I love it. There's a place in Washington where all the citizens came together to say, here's how we want to spend our money and here's where we want to invest. We want to invest in our education system and all that kind of stuff. And really got to help make decisions that would then choose how their community wanted to live and exist. And anyways, long answer again, but I think our ability to do that and to make change, and then also to hopefully be able to elect somebody who can have that mindset for our community. I just think I do think it's alive. It's just not everywhere. And I see the ways that we can get it to be closer to everywhere. And I see a lot of Americans who want that to happen, who are every day fighting to make it happen. So I think we'll get there, but it's definitely slower than I wish it was.
And there have been some movements for reform in this. So I assume, is the Netherlands some sort of proportional representation kind of system? There's been a little bit of talk about moving towards that in the US. I believe HR 1, which is kind of the Democrats' reform package, touched on that a little bit. But even ranked choice voting kind of addresses the idea of wasted votes. And the League of Women Voters here in town brought Erica Frazier to talk about that a little bit. And I guess the Kansas Democratic primary brought on that system a little bit. That's a bit easier than proportional representation to enact. But I guess looking at the more technical law side, we're dabbling a little bit, but we're not quite to the European standards.
Yeah, I would agree. I see that there's different cities working on different reforms of their ranked choice voting, or I think Missouri is just working on, St. Louis is just doing approval voting. And I think there's different, I think people are definitely interested. We heard that when we were doing our town halls. There was always a couple different people who were talking about proportional government too. And, the cool part, I think, is that if a state really wanted to take that on, they could. It's kind of, But we have things to learn. 100% we have things to learn.
Cool. So now we are excited and surprised about this, but Senator Ware has joined us. And we want to have a little intro, and then we'll ask for your thoughts and comments if that's all good.
Awesome.
So Mary Ware is currently serving as a member of the Kansas Senate representing the 25th Senate District in Wichita. So yeah, if you have any thoughts on the film or thoughts on gerrymandering, that'd be awesome.
I thought okay, it is working. Wasn't sure. I thought the film was exciting. Before I was in the Senate, I was involved in a lot of grassroots efforts in many directions. And so it's always a thrill for me to see people power, in action, and especially with success, because that doesn't always happen. But and gerrymandering, oh my goodness, it is a big deal. What I was hoping I would also hear in our discussion is what folks are doing, if there's a group, if there's, if the efforts here in our state towards something like what you guys did. And that's what I haven't heard exactly yet.
Well, I know the League of Women Voters, at least here in town, has taken it up as a platform issue. I don't know how organized they've been on this specific issue, but it is definitely, I mean, the League across the country has been great on this sort of stuff. The big North Carolina case, they were one of the co-litigants on that. So, yeah.
So does anyone have any more questions they would like to comment? And thank you, Senator Ware, for commenting.
I was just saying, I know that Common Cause and NAACP, Sierra Club, ACLU also all have national stances on redistricting and all have resources. A couple of their organizational models are based off of wanting people in a state to want this to happen, and then they'll help with that. But I think there's probably some other orgs too who'd be very excited to see if there were people wanting to take this on.
Did your success hinge on being able to have a citizens initiative so that it went on the ballot, correct? And that's something we don't have here. So that would be an effort that would have to come first, I would think.
It could. So even though we were doing that too, and it doesn't necessarily make sense for this year, but once the new maps are drawn, a lawsuit is the other way that people in states that do not have ballot initiatives are fighting back, where they legally try and prove that yes, there were different voters targeted either because of their race or because of which party they vote for, who are purposely targeted in these lines being drawn. And there's been some really big successes there. Pennsylvania is a great example of that. And so I think that's an option. But again, I would say, so trying to change the laws is probably your top thing that you want to do. So making sure you're talking to people who are up for election, who will be drawing those lines and seeing who they are, but also seeing, for the next legislative cycle, it sounded like if a bill could be introduced. But also, and I'm not exactly sure how it works in Kansas, but at least in Michigan, they still held public hearings. They were just at the state capitol when they were discussing this. And there are many meetings that were not public, but there were a couple that were public. And I think people showing up and still talking about how they want the lines to be drawn, still talking about your community, not only will that help you later if you do decide to bring a court case, because you can show that your testimony was completely ignored, but it still also might have people thinking differently. People don't often just run for office because they're a jerk. They want to do their civic duty too. Just sometimes, there's many temptations while in office, or maybe they want their opinion to just go through or whatever it is. But going and saying, hey, here's what I care about, you really could make a difference while those lines are being drawn and thought about. And I wouldn't discount yourselves for that too, where showing up could at least maybe make it less gerrymandered, or could still try and make sure that lines are being drawn for representation, not political parties.
Yeah, I guess to tag on to that, the department, political science department at Wichita State is planning to hold a redistricting competition to encourage people to get that sort of public input. And yeah, at least 10 years or 8 years ago, I believe they had meetings across the state, but they also accepted example maps that people put in. So we're going to try to get, high school, college students, and then general public to get involved in that.
That's awesome.
In general,
And the governor's office is powerful in that too. So seeing if the governor has a stance on redistricting, they get to approve it. I know that the governor in Wisconsin right now is actually doing a similar thing. They're holding a contest basically they're having a commission draw the maps. And even though those ones won't be the ones that they're adopted, the governor is basically being like, I will shame you, legislature, into at least having to deal with seeing like what these should look like if you guys aren't going to do a fair process.
Yeah, you raise a great point about, the state ignoring that input is a great argument in court. Like in Florida, we saw some of that success where sometimes the state will try to feign ignorance about a particular plan, like, oh, we just couldn't find a fair map. If we can present a fair map to them before they actually have a vote, if there is a challenge later on, that can be powerful. So having people doing that looking through a contest it can be valuable.
okay, awesome. Well, I mean, in general, if anybody has any questions, now would be the time to speak up. Any questions for Dr. Amos or Katie Fahey? We would love to hear them now. And if not, we can also start to wrap up. Thank you guys so much for being here with us. We would like to thank all of you guys for joining us today. We really hope you all continue to stay home and can be an activist remotely. We have recorded this conversation and we'll be sharing it soon in the event page and on our social media. Please pass it on to your friends and family, especially as we get closer to the election. And we cannot emphasize this enough. Please go and vote. We would love for you guys to go out and vote, especially now when we have to make a difference from home.
Also, we want to thank Katie Fahey and Dr. Brian Amos for joining us. Additionally, Lauren and I want to thank Mama Film, who partnered with us on this, Leela Meadow-Connor, and Gretchen Mitchell for advising us through this process. Do you guys want to wave? I see Gretchen in the chat. And Leela, there we go. And we couldn't have done it without you guys. And we're happy that we're able to do it this year because, yeah. So thank you.
Katie and Dr. Amos, do you guys have any closing thoughts before we go?
I just want to thank, Julie and Lauren for putting this together. Yeah, obviously it wasn't easy under the current circumstances, but this was great.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very uplifting and nice. I feel like I'm in a community right now. And I just want to say thanks to you. And again, anybody who's thinking about what can I do to actually take on this really big system, even though I know that it's super broken, you are not alone. There are so many of us doing research, helping students continue to go into this field, but also your fellow citizens who also care and are right there with you. So we're not alone, even when it feels that way. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So
thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah, I think we're going to head out now, but thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.